Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you're all doing well. Exposure bracketing is a technique that I use constantly, sometimes unnecessarily, but it's absolutely one of the most important tools to know as a landscape photographer. And the good news is it's a very easy technique to learn, and best of all, it can really bring your photos to the next level in the right circumstances. Within this video, we're going to talk about why you should exposure bracket, when you should do it, and of course, how to accomplish it out in the field. So let's jump right in. So I've seen quite a few tutorials on a lot of subjects that cover how to do something, but they never explain why. And I think it's really important to understand why you're doing something rather than just doing it because someone told you it's important. So the human eye is estimated to be able to see up to 30 stops of dynamic range. And you might be asking, what is dynamic range? Dynamic range is just the measured amount of light between the darkest parts and the brightest parts of a scene. Thus, the higher the dynamic range, the wider amount of luminance values you can see in your scene. If this is confusing, think about it like this. Take your phone to a bright window in your house and take a picture, making sure that the HDR setting on your phone is turned off and also leaving part of the frame within the picture. You'll notice that your eyes can see everything in the scene. They can see outside in the bright areas, and they can even see inside in the dark areas of the frame. But your phone can't capture all of those details. This is because your eyes see at a much larger range of luminance than your phone can. Thus, your eyes have a much wider dynamic range. Regardless if you're using a phone or the newest camera on the market, you'll encounter this limitation, and it is exactly why exposure bracketing is so important to use. All right, so this next part I actually intended to do out in the field, but the weather did not cooperate, and yeah, wind makes audio really difficult. And if you're new to this channel, this is what it's all about. Either going out into the field and stumbling my way through explaining my process, or sitting here in the office editing and talking all things photography. So if you end up enjoying this video, please give it a like, and if I haven't ran you off yet, consider subscribing. So yeah, that wind made the audio unusable, so we're just going to be going over how to do it right here in this warm and cozy office. Executing an exposure bracket in the field is pretty simple. All you're doing is taking multiple shots at different exposures of the same composition. In my experience, this is typically 3 photos taken at -2 EV, 0 EV, and +2 EV. But this can be 5, 9, 7, 11 exposures. Here's what you'll need. A camera that can adjust ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. This could even be your phone if you have the capabilities. You're going to want a tripod or a spot for your camera to rest, and a 2-second timer or shutter release cable. Next, you'll need a scene. Here's me setting up the shot we'll be using in this example, and you'll notice I wasn't able to capture the dynamic range even within this video. This is a scene where I'm shooting directly into the sun while simultaneously having shadowed areas, the perfect time to exposure bracket. Many cameras have bracketing built in where you can just set your camera to take a certain number of exposures, such as 3, 5, or 7, and you can choose how far apart those exposures are in terms of exposure value. You're seeing how I do this on my Canon R5, which is how you do it on most Canon cameras, but you can find how to do this for all major manufacturers online. Instead, let's go over how to do it manually so that your camera actually doesn't matter, and because there are rules you'll need to follow regardless of how you decide to take multiple exposures. So the first thing you're going to want to do is set your camera to manual. The main objective here is to just take 3 of the same shots with different exposures, but you'll only want to change your shutter speed to change that exposure. Hence, one of the reasons you might need a tripod in the case that your exposure times get quite long. You want to avoid changing your aperture because doing so can cause slight shifts in your framing. And also changing your ISO can increase the noise or cause slight color shifts between exposures. I recommend setting your ISO to 100 and your aperture to f8 or f11. Next, you'll want to focus on your subject. In my case, it was the tree. Here in my house, it was a statue. And then you'll make sure you turn off autofocus to prevent accidental shifts in focus when taking your shots. Lastly, you'll want to take your photos as fast as possible, so things like clouds in the sky don't move very much, but you also want to be careful not to shake your camera in between those exposures. A good way to do this is to use a cable release or at least a 2-second timer for your shots. So I'll have my shot set up, take my 0 EV exposure, increase the shutter speed until my meter says -2 EV, take a shot, and then decrease my shutter speed until my meter says +2 EV and take the final shot. Now, this becomes even easier if your camera has a bracketing mode, like I mentioned earlier, as it'll take all of your shots, adjusting the shutter speed automatically to whatever EVs you picked in the settings. It's still important to follow the other rules, such as manual focus and using a 2-second timer, but it does make life much easier. So the other thing you might be asking yourself is how many exposures should you take? This is up to you and will also be dependent on the scene you're taking a photo of, which brings up the even bigger question, when should you exposure bracket? A good rule of thumb is if you take a photo and look at your histogram after taking it, if there's anything clipping in that photo, it's probably good to try and take multiple exposures. That being said, it will vary heavily depending on the camera, and in reality, it doesn't hurt to take extra shots. I mean, memory cards are pretty cheap nowadays. In time, you're going to understand your camera's limitations, and you'll have a good idea of when to exposure bracket in the field after you've taken them back to edit and reviewed those images. You'll notice I only took 3 exposures rather than 5 or 7. You might need to take more than 3 exposures, but in my experience, it's rare if I ever take more than 3. Every once in a while, I will take 5. But again, this will depend on your camera's capabilities and dynamic range. This is where exposure bracketing is really great because it can actually help older cameras continue to take very dynamic images. I actually thought this concept was so important enough that I took my old 60 out into the field to demonstrate. And in that, I actually took the same scene with my Canon 60, which has roughly 11.5 stops of dynamic range versus the Canon R5's nearly 15 stops of dynamic range. This means that the R5 I can get away with not needing to exposure bracket as often, but it also means that I can take a 9-year-old camera like the 60 and still make great images with it. All right, so speaking of the images, let's dive into taking a look at some of them. My intention with this video was to explain the method for exposure bracketing, so I won't be focusing on exactly how to edit your photos together, but I do have a ton of content already on my channel for doing exactly that. As I said, it's a technique that I use often. There's 2 major ways to edit your exposure bracketed images. The first one is luminosity masking or exposure blending, which is what I use the majority of the time, and I even have a video on it right here. On top of that, if you've ever tuned in to some of my live streams, I exposure blend quite often in those as well. And even if you can't catch them while they're live, many of those videos end up on my channel so that you can watch them anytime you want. The second method is going to be to combine the images into an HDR image, which stands for high dynamic range. HDR became really popular in the early 2010s, and it kind of gave the method a bad look because software at the time pushed the images pretty far, along with photographers having a heavy hand on those sliders. In today's world, you can get away with making an HDR image without anyone actually knowing that's what you did. This isn't a method I use often, only because I tend to want more creative control of my images using luminosity masks, but for the sake of time, we'll be combining our images in HDR, and you should get a good idea of why exposure bracketing is so important. So let's jump into Lightroom. All right, so first we're going to start by taking a look at the Canon R5 image, and this is just a single image, the 0 EV exposure, and you can tell in our histogram that we're clipping in the blacks and clipping in the whites on both sides. And you can tell that the camera exposed pretty dark to try to cover up all of that bright area in the sky. And here is our -2 EV, so our darker exposure, and we get a lot more detail in the sky there. And here is our +2 EV, and this is the exposure that's going to give us all the detail in those dark areas. So what you're going to want to do to make an HDR is just select your 3 exposures, right-click them, photo merge, and HDR. It'll bring up a menu. Usually the settings that I use the most are auto align. Even if you use a tripod, auto aligning your images is still pretty important. The auto settings I don't normally use, and the deghost amount is going to be for things that might be moving in your image. Typically, I use either none or low if maybe the clouds moved a little bit, but because I was using the exposure bracket setting built into my R5, the images are taken pretty much a split second apart from each other. The other thing you can do is select create stack, and that'll just combine all 4 of the final images into one stack. For organizational purposes, that's up to you. And then I'll click merge. Once the merge is done, it'll bring your photo to an HDR image. Now you're going to notice that there's not a whole lot of difference in appearance between these 2 images, but something to keep in mind that's really important is, let's say I go to my 0 EV exposure and I bring down the highlights and I bring up the shadows. Now, even though I brought these down by 100 or increased by 100, that's different than if I was going to do it within this HDR image. The reason is Just because these sliders have the same numbers, plus 100 and minus 100, the same scale, that doesn't mean they're not working with more dynamic images. So watch this. So if I bring my highlights down all the way on the HDR image and the shadows up all the way, you can get a really good idea, swapping between these two images, what you're actually gaining out of that HDR image. Now, we have way more clarity and detail in the cloud area, which is pretty sweet. All right, so like I said before, one of the cool things about exposure bracketing is that you can take older cameras and breathe new life into the images that they're taking. Let's take a look really quick. So here we have the Canon R5's single exposure like we had before. I'm actually going to bring the highlights down all the way and the shadows up all the way. And the reason I'm doing this is just to give us a quick idea of what information is actually there in the image. I don't recommend editing your image like this. And so I'm going to do the exact same thing to an HDR version of what came out of the Canon 6D. So I've already taken the 3 exposures that I took with the Canon 6D and merged them into a HDR image. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to bring down the highlights by 100 and the shadows up by 100. And then we're going to compare the 2 images. You'll notice that obviously there's more detail in the sky. This is going to be pretty typical just because those highlights are usually the hardest to recover in a single image. But what I think is really important, more important than just that, is the amount of detail and clarity and cleanliness of the shadows on the left image here, which is the Canon 6D. And you might be wondering, well, you just compared an HDR image to a single exposure from a new camera. But that's kind of the whole point, is that you can take a decade-old camera, take an exposure bracket, and get very close or even better looking images than a single exposure from a brand new camera. Now, if I were to compare the R5's HDR image to the Canon 6D's, they obviously would not be as close, but it is still pretty close. And I think that's a testament to how important this tool is to use regardless of what camera you're shooting on. Man, I think it's amazing that we can take such an old camera and essentially improve its dynamic range by 4 stops just by taking exposure brackets. You could even do 6 stops or 8 stops if you took more photos. Regardless, this should absolutely be a technique you know how to use out in the field as a landscape photographer. I have found lately that I'm not needing to take as many exposure bracketed images because of newer technology, but I am still taking multiple shots a lot of times, just in case, to potentially get every last detail out of a scene. So I hope this video was helpful for all skill levels, and as always, I'd love to know if you have any questions or critiques down in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Later.